Hey, all you happy lost souls. Thank you all for checking it out. Whether you hate it or love it, thank you for your time. If I wasted it, I apologize. But luckily for YouTube, you're going to find something you like out there. Anyways, I talk a lot about rocks, artifacts, my own stone tool collection that comes from a few creeks in Pennsylvania that run ultimately into the Delaware's watershed. But anyways, I want to talk more about theories and how hypotheses become theory or become a working idea once they're supported by evidence. The evidence for the Solutrean hypothesis or the Solutrean theory. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 20 to 50, 20 years ago probably, they started, finding points along the eastern coast. I think down in Virginia, I think even in Delaware, in the bay, down in the deposits where they could be dated. But there's people that still practice stone napping, and people that are so serious about learning the art of stone napping. These are essentially archaeologists, but they're practicing archaeologists, so they're experimental archaeologists. And these people are more valuable than anybody digging out in the dirt, because once we find an item and we can only speculate what it was used for and how it was created, we need to be able to recreate it to show purpose, to show efficacy. And the word efficacy is so important, to show intent in design. And I completely have to say the Solutrean theory absolutely holds weight. Especially when you start seeing some of the pictures I posted up here. This is an easy find. Just Google image any of it. Look at, overhead view of the ice sheets 13,000 years ago, during the last great ice age. Look at it, and look at where the ice is. Now, I'm in southeastern Pennsylvania, right near the Delaware. The ice stops probably about 30 miles north of here. There are boulder fields known as Ringing Rocks up in Bucks County. There's boulder fields out in the Hamburg area. I used to stay at a campground called Blue Rocks. This is literally they were picked up by glaciers and carried, and then when that glacier melted and left, that's what was left, these giant boulder fields that it drug as it cut through and chewed up a mountain. So we find tons of Solutrean artifacts, and some of these longer, skinnier, scalpel, needle looking items, they were sewing and manufacturing a lot of hide. This is a cold period of time. They were seal hunters. Solutrean literally means seal hunters. And at that time period, when this world was undergoing this crazy dynamic change, falling into another ice age, it happened in cycles of every couple 10,000 years, another one seems to happen as you go back into time, back and forth. Anyways, this kind of screwed up all the food sources. The Solutreans were hunting horses on land, and they started having to get closer to the coast as this ice kept moving down, because they were running out of food because the land was being eaten up, and animals were dying, things were migrating elsewhere, and they were just running out of food and resources. Have to make a decision. We know a seal is full of fat nutrition, and we can make wonderful clothing and boats out of its skin. We know that they run along the ice. So now let me tell you guys about the oceans back then. The oceans were much lower. Florida was about 3 times its width right now, just for context. And, it was hotter, as hot as, it was a desert, essentially. It was a dry area. Where Jersey is now, where the ocean is, there was a whole nother Jersey-sized piece of land before the water back then, all running down the coast. And the ice stopped halfway through PA, essentially, and just continued right across the ocean, and then it kind of went up north a bit in the ocean, and then kind of came back down and kind of went into the Spain and France region, is where the ice cut in half. So what ended up happening is the Gulf current flows in a circular pattern going from France back to France in a circle like this, the ice. So these people, over time, hunting these seals, what must have happened is they got on a piece of ice, right? And during the warmer months, that ice was flowing a lot more. It would free itself. They were out there, and as it started to warm, a piece of ice that were on kind of broke off, and it started moving. And these things could move about 4 miles an hour. Okay, they could go a couple thousand miles in a couple weeks. So 2,000 miles, 2/3 of the way across the Atlantic on a automated moving piece of ice. And I'm sure many people died doing this, but they were going to die if they stayed because there's nothing to eat. They could hunt the seals as they went. These were not hunters. I mean, these were not farmers. They're not agricultural people. These were hunter and gatherers. They needed to hunt to live, and they needed to hunt big prey items, and the seals gave them their nutrition. And over this course of survival, they found it was way harder to get back, and they just let the ice carry them where it took them, and lo and behold, they must have found a heaven, because they landed here, all these rich animals, all these vast resources. Now, that is not to say they were the only people here when they got here. There could have been other people here already, which I really believe there were. So I'm into nothing about discovering America, because it wasn't even called America 13,000 years ago. It wasn't called France or Spain. None of these names existed. None of these people that had those names were born yet. So let's get all the politics out of this. I'm strictly into the evidence I find. I don't want to try to fit the evidence into my story. I want to look at the evidence and try to go from there. And when I'm finding this layer of mass production going on at these quarry sites, this was not happening during any kind of written history. When the Europeans got over here, these Native Americans weren't quarrying those sites, because they weren't. And we have documented writing of the natives along the Pennypack. They were the Susquehannock. Primarily, they had pushed the Algonquin out by the late 1500s, 1600s. They communicated these stories of silver mines, and they traded great amounts of furs for guns and cannons with the Europeans. When George Washington originally got over, when they were over here, when the English got over here, and they called the Susquehanna the Conestoga, when they got over here, all these tribes had cannons already. I mean, the Susquehanna did. They were warlike people. Anyways, they traded with the settlers along the creek, peaceful back and forth. And we know that there was no Native American village at that point anywhere around here. There was no agriculture, farmland settlement. There was seasonal camping areas for hunting grounds. Apparently the area flooded way more back then. The amount of civil engineering now that controls everything is different. It's more like a swamp than it was a creek in a lot of places. These sites where these rich veins of soapstone and all that sort of stuff, and the efficacy, and put some pictures up here of a tray of artifacts here that is all soapstone. It's just soapstone artifacts, and I put it on here just to show you what efficacy means. You're not finding one or two, you're finding a dozen or 100 in one area. There are so many soapstone artifacts in these places that I've only taken a handful of, like, cool ones. And the really cool thing about how soft this soapstone is when it gets wet, the fingerprints of the creators, you can still see them in the stone. You can see their hand, their fingerprints. So they're very, very cool. I even have one where there's two artifacts that got fused together. There's a planing tool on top of something that was smoothing a spear out, and when it got covered up and water got put into it, it hardened together. Now, oddly enough, the Solutreans practiced a spiritual. They had a shaman. They were exactly as what we know Native American tradition on the East Coast tribes, at least anyway, is. And you've got a lot of these creation stories like the Algonquins that surround Turtle Island. There's variations of the story. Some of them say that the original people came here on the backs of a turtle. Now, that's interesting anthropologically. It could be some kind of kafra or kufr, some kind of circular shaped boat that we knew that were being used in ancient times as well. I don't know what kind of craft they were using, but they didn't need much, because what ended up happening is they got on pieces of these giant, and these pieces weren't little pieces of ice. I'm talking about Rhode Island sized pieces of ice that were pack ice. They were flat. I mean, you could have ran a sled across them if you wanted to. But in the summer months, right along the edge where the water meets the sea, those pieces start to fragment out and start being carried by the Gulf. So think of it as this like circular thing going around that has a bunch of little pre-made ice ships on it that deliver you to America in about 4 weeks. And here's the messed up thing. During the summer, it's circular. Like an escalator, they can get to America, hop back on another piece of ice, and come right back over. And we know that the return ice is right down in North and South Carolina. That's how low the Gulf dropped down to bring those pieces of ice back. Now, what they had to have a boat for is probably on that way back, as that lower ice is coming back. You got to time it perfect. And I really, really think this is a huge reason why the stars and the sun and that became important. And I believe these people knew about this prior to agriculture. And really people say, oh, we learned about, the seasons and the solstice because of when to plant. No, we originally had to learn this knowledge because of how to get somewhere, and if we had to get back. And what I imagine happened is a group of people got over there. They found glory. Found a land that was way more packed with nourishment and food because there was less humans. That's my assumption. I don't know what was here. I think there might have been some proto-human groups here. I think Denisovans were all over here because of my Denisovan style tools or Neanderthal style tools. This is a much older group. I don't know how long they persisted. And they had to persist for a long time because their DNA is still in groups of modern humans. So, like the Neanderthal, they were probably assimilated. And the Solutreans were probably assimilated into the Denisovans, which is why you don't see their DNA in anybody. But you see a lot of Denisovan DNA in Native Americans, because not enough of them got here. But I believe that they taught and they exchanged information about how to make stone tools. I believe that these were peaceful people because there's not a whole lot of evidence of war in that layer. There's more of evidence of community and the beginning of planting. So happening much sooner than we thought. And then all of a sudden you start getting into the period of time where things stop again. So like between 20,000 to 15,000 years, there was a lot of activity of these Solutrean sites. And then all of a sudden there's another period of like nothing. And it's almost like they vacated or had moved on or had died off, or I don't know if something else cataclysmic happened in this specific area, or maybe they went back. Who knows? I have no idea. Disease, who the fuck knows? But there's this period of time where they're not really there. So I don't think they came in contact with the Clovis culture, but I think the Clovis culture came in contact with their previous work areas, like their quarries, and they just recycled work that was already done. Solutreans were manufacturing these tools. They were making preforms and stamps before they were ultimately probably given to a master that could do the really tedious flaking work. And these people were probably honored like gods for their ability to make these crazy points and things like that. Just a lot more focus in stone and understanding how beautiful they use the stone. And these people were artists, and that's the next thing we have to look for at these areas. And I'll throw a couple pictures up, but there are caves all over a few of these areas, and they're not very explored because they're very dangerous. Some of them are underwater now, Some of them are like the size of a bucket to get into, but then they open up into like a castle. We got to find where they lived, and they were living in rock shelters, most likely, or caves. And they were bound to have left the beautiful art, because we see some of the beautiful art they carved in the mammoths, and with the mammoth head pendant that we have, and these other side profiles of animals. And these people weren't like Mesolithic. They were Paleo-Neolithic people, and they were starting to plant and form community and society here before we thought that was possible. Like I said, though, I don't know if they influenced the Clovis at all, because their technology was different, their shafting was different. I think they never really ran into each other, but I do think the Solutreans ran into a group that was already here, and they were probably more what we know as the Denisovan, but possibly not. I mean, because we have to trace back the Denisovan Migration, which we know their DNA starts from Australia, essentially, in the Aborigine people, and it spreads out into South America, and their DNA got there that way. But one thing I'll say is to say that all the people that populated North America came through the Beringian land passage, which was only exposed for a couple periods throughout a few thousand years, which is a way harder route. It's way harder to travel over land, especially back then. Everything wanted to eat you and kill you. There were no roads, there was no paths, there were no trails, there's no infrastructure. You followed migrational herds. You had to walk over mountains full of ice. You only had handmade equipment, the best you could muster. Land route would have taken exceptionally longer time to get all the way across America, or all the way down. To say that all the people in South America were descendants of people that crossed that Beringian opening is a complete falsity, because the DNA says it is. But anyway, I believe they got here. I believe they probably weren't here in gigantic number. I believe they stayed, though. They were peaceful with those they came in contact with, which these people also probably had knowledge. I believe they figured out how to get back. They maybe send a small group back to tell others about it. And over time, and remember, to make that trip on that piece of ice from France or Spain to North America on the Gulf current only takes about 4 to 5 weeks. And you don't have to paddle. And you barely have to have a usable boat. Only if you have to get from one piece of ice to another, or to maybe change your position up a bit, or maybe it pulls you really close to the coast, but the ice doesn't go all the way to the coast, so you need a boat to get the rest of the way there. But it makes this a lot more digestible if we look at how nature and science automation was taken advantage of by these ancient native people of Solutreans. Their influence religiously must have worn off somehow, because they bury their most well-made artifacts are left buried, and they're left buried when they get to a new place, when things are going wrong, to ask the gods for things. And I think that this practice was carried on when people were leaving things in water, making sacrifices in dark pools, which was like a Mayan thing. This ancient tradition probably diffused on somehow through the secrets of the shamans and the Juradic principles and that kind of stuff. But anyways, there are all kinds of people here, and we're not going to argue about who was here first. We're only going to argue that there were people here way before 13,000 years ago. 13,000 years wasn't the oldest people. It was just when a big bomb went off, called a comet, and wiped everything out for a couple thousand years, and it starts picking up again. So you hit 13,000 years, comet hits, 14,000, 15,000, 16,000, nothing. I mean, there was nothing after 13,000 for a long time. So they dug through this large, barren area, hit 13,000, didn't see any more tools. So, and that's the hard thing to choke on. That something that serious happened. But just because they didn't see anything and they dug down deeper, what happened is 13,000 years kept finding tools all the way back 13,000 years, and all of a sudden, no more tools. All right, that was like 100 years of soil. Let's go down 500 more. No more tools. That's weird. Let's go down 1,000 more years just to check. No more tools. And you know what? To be really safe, let's go down one more 1,000 years. There had to have been 15. Nothing. Oh, that must be when the first humans were here. That was prior to the understanding that a giant comet hit in 13,000 years and wiped everything out. It took about 4,000 years for rehabilitation. So the Solutreans may have been some of the very first here. There may have been a couple other pockets here, but they would have had pretty much a lot more food, a lot more opportunity of resource here. And so they probably didn't have to come back. And just keep it in mind. You got to have a very open mind, and you have to look at all aspects. You have to look at the time period, what the weather was, what the geology was, who the people were, what were they eating, what types of arrows were they making. The Solutreans made all kinds of saws and little tiny crescent shapes and hooks and a lot of sewing type clothing. It's a very cold time period. They were stitching up seal hides to make boats and all kinds of hides to make waterproof clothing. It was an ice age after all. Okay. So anyways, it's all really clever to think about. But if you look at those maps and see what Earth was doing then, and you were starving to death and all your people are starving to death, and you had a chance, you would take a chance. You would assume that you're probably not going to make it, but there was no other choice. This was it. It was that or death. And then lo and behold, lucky ass motherfuckers found that nature did most of the work for them. And before you know it, it carried them all the way across. And I say lucky because these people probably suffered their asses off, the first couple people getting across. Probably 10 made out of 50 that left, they were lucky. But to think that it didn't take 4 or 5 months to get across that ocean, it only took 4 weeks. You'd only have to kill 1 or 2 seals to get a large group across. Anyways, just think about it. I think we underestimate ourselves a lot because they were the same as us. They were the same minds, the same body types, essentially. Modern human, essentially, the Solutrean, just, So, what? You're telling me we couldn't all figure out how to build a boat and put it on an ocean if our lives depended on it? Come on. Anyway, please subscribe. Thank you for all your support. I love you all. And if you hate me, you can comment. If you love me, comment. I don't really read YouTube comments very often. I should probably start reading some of the positive ones, but I figure just let it be. Yeah, anyways, if you want to get a hold of me directly, you can Instagram, DM me, and I'll get back to you generally. And that's Happy Lost Souls 27 is my Instagram handle. And anyways, please subscribe, please share, please add it to any kind of playlist that you guys have that involves artifact hunting, so everything can kind of come together with the algorithm. And just keep exploring and have fun and get lost and be happy about it. Peace.